Morning, everyone. This is Rick Wycheck again. I want to welcome you back to day 2 of our September council meeting. And we're going to get right into the presentation by Dr. Valentine. And I have to say, I'm just so pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Valentine. She is the NIH Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. She joined the NIH in 2014 and has done just an absolutely outstanding job carrying out a comprehensive strategy for promoting inclusiveness and equity throughout the NIH biomedical research enterprise. Her focus on expanding recruitment and retention of the brightest minds, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, and disability, and socioeconomic status, has produced absolutely remarkable results. So prior to the NIH, Dr. Valentine was the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity and Leadership, the Director of the Heart Transplantation Research, and the Professor of Medicine at Stanford University. And unfortunately, it pains me to say this, but unfortunately, Dr. Collins announced earlier this month that Dr. Valentine will soon be retiring home to California and Stanford University at the end of September. So we have her for at least a few more weeks. So while we will miss her leadership in the NIH, and I will miss having personal interactions with her, I think it's safe to say that we all feel that Dr. Valentine has created a very positive change at the NIH, and she will leave a lasting legacy that we will all build on. So even though this is a very busy time for her and she's preparing to transition to California, she has nevertheless agreed to address all of us today. And she will be speaking on bias and systematic racism in academic healthcare. And what are the NIH strategies for change? So I am confident that she will set us all up for some provocative ideas that I suspect will trigger some lively discussion during the rest of today's meeting. So Hannah, thank you again for joining us. And I know I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. I'll just start off by saying it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to NIEHS Council. I know that one is not supposed to have favorites, but NIEHS has been a particularly close institute for me. Since I got here, the outreach and welcoming both by the IC director and your amazing scientific director, Daryl Zalden, has been just wonderful. And as you will see from the data, that commitment to diversity and inclusion at the very top by Daryl and a lot of others has resulted in some remarkable changes that put NIEHS really at the forefront of all of the institutes for this work. So I am absolutely delighted to be here. What I'm going to be talking about is outlined in this slide. I'll speak to you a little bit about why diversity and inclusion matters. And I always like to present the data around the why. Why are we doing this? What do we see in the data and what do we hope to change? I'll be speaking specifically about the issue of bias in medicine and academic medicine and in science, and hopefully giving you all some pointers about what to do about it. The phenomena is well described. The challenge is what to do about it. And then I'll wrap this all up by the integrated approach that I've had the honor of developing here at NIH, and I think it's paying off, and then share some reflections about racist systemic racism, which is part of the issue, but very important to address specifically. So why does it matter? Why does diversity matter? Lots of research that shows that when we have diversity in teams, we have more creativity, more ability to solve complex problems. And what can be more complex than health disparities? When we have a diverse team, we broaden the scope of inquiry. We ask new questions of the science. And in my own field, for example, in cardiology, as we had more women join the cardiology enterprise, we learned more about heart disease in women that benefited not just women, but a greater understanding of the pathophysiology of arterial disease in general. The third issue is that the reality, the changing demographics of this country compel us to pay attention to who is getting into science and who are we leaving behind. People like myself, when we would give this talk about 10 years ago, we'd say that, well, in 2050, the minority groups will be the majority. Well, it's actually already happened in certain states and in certain age groups, for example, in California. And if NIH is really to ensure that it is pulling from its entire intellectual capital, we must be inclusive in our work to bring in more people with diverse perspectives. And of course, all of this feeds into maintaining our global preeminence in the US as the forefront of biomedical research. So this slide really is just meant to depict for you the diminishing representation of women and certain racial ethnic groups as we move along the career path. And what you see on the vertical axis is the representation in percentages, and across is the from the very early stages of associate degrees right the way through to full professors and department chairs. And if you look at the yellow group, which is women who are underrepresented racial ethnic groups, that is to say, Hispanic, African American, American Indian, Pacific Islander, these groups diminish to minuscule representation as you move along the career path. And some might like to argue that this is simply a cohort effect. Just wait, and with time it will get better. But the women depicted in green, this is the well-represented group, defined as white or Asian American, have the same pattern. We know that women have represented over 50% of the PhD recipient pool in biological sciences for greater than 25 years, and we're seeing the same pattern. So what that means to me is that there is something in our cultures and our workplace climate that is putting people off from staying even when we recruit them. So that speaks to the need for better inclusion and not just to focus on the demographic data. I like presenting this slide, especially when I present it to NAEHS, because this gives the disaggregated data within the NIH intramural program. When I got here, part of my charge was to really pay attention to diversity in the intramural program and develop strategies that might actually benefit for our NIH-supported institutions outside the universities. And what I'm showing you here is the representation of tenure track women, tenured women, and women in lab and branch chief positions. And you can see I've rank ordered them. And this is really purposeful to get some competition going when I presented to the entire NIH group. But what you can see, NIEHS, as far as women are concerned in the tenure track, over 60%, and really leading the pack there. Similarly, for tenure track investigators at NIEHS, it's close to 30%, whereas the average is about 25% across the NIH. And then when we look at leadership positions, that's to say lab and branch chiefs, we see 40% for the for NIEHS. And I show this because if you look down there, there are institutes that are not doing as well. So my approach has always been ask the institutes what they're doing and then learn from best practices so that we can bring everybody along. It is not a shaming exercise, but rather an exercise to learn. And here's a little bit more in-depth look at this data from 2019. Again, attesting to the great work that Daryl Zeldin has been doing in diversifying the internal workforce. So here, as I showed you before, women in the NAEHS intramural program comprise nearly 70%, and in tenured positions, they're nearly 30%. And if you look at race and ethnicity as shown on the slide, you can see that underrepresented groups with the definition defined below here, African American, Hispanic, American Indian, Pacific Islander, and you can see that is over 30%. 30%. Nowhere will you find that representation of assistant professors from underrepresented groups in extramural universities. So really, we need to learn what is happening in this institute. And that happens actually through the auspices of an NIH Equity Committee, which we started. We get each institute scientific director to present and tell us what they're doing so that others can learn. And on the right-hand side here, what you're seeing is the representation of the tenured investigators, 7.3%. And again, that's way above what we see generally. But let's not forget that the NIH intramural programs are small relative to what's going on in our NIH funded institutions out there. And for that matter, one of the driving reasons for the creation of this position, which I now hold, was the recognition that there was a tremendous funding gap for investigators applying for R01 grants. And what was found is reported in the Ginther report in 2011 was that African American applicants were significantly less likely to have their R01 grants funded. And actually that was also the case for K awards, which is that stage just before the independent investigators. And what I'm trying to show you here is the data for K awards in 2013 compared to 2018. And the success rate for African Americans shown in red was 22% compared to 34% for white applicants for K awards, a big gap there. But now when we look at the data in 2018, what we're seeing that the award rate is 34% for African American compared to 37% for white applicants. And that difference is no longer statistically significant. So we're moving the needle, but the data is very clear that even though we're bridging the gap, the funding gap, the numbers are minuscule. African American applicants are about sort of 500 applications only a year compared to the thousands of applications from other people. So it's about 1.1% of the applicant pool. And that speaks to the lack of African Americans as in assistant professor positions. These are the people who are applying. So it means we have more work to do. Just by narrowing this gap does not mean that we are succeeded and we can stop this work. And here, what I'm showing you is the applications rates now for R01 2018 compared to 2013, and the funding rates. And what you can see here is that the funding rates for African Americans went from 12% to 20%. Yes, it's increased, but this gap still remains for R01 grants particularly. An increase, an improvement, I recognize that, but we've got to do a lot more. So how are we going about it? We're really looking at the data. Everything that we do must be data driven. And so in that light, we from NIH published this paper late last year, identifying that topic choice was contributing to the funding gap. And what that means is that we found that inherently there were certain topics that had a lower success rate. And then guess what? African American applicants tended more likely to apply to those areas as opposed to other areas. And we concluded here that the analysis shows that all three of the factors that underlie the funding gap, meaning preference for some topics over others, assignment of poorer scores, and decisions, revolved around reviewer decisions. Well, it turns out that is not the full story. It's partly true, but additional analyses have revealed that, in fact, there's a widely varying award rate within institution, and that particular factor has a major contributing to the gap, meaning that African Americans seem to be applying more to those institutes which coincidentally have a lower funding rate, and that is also contributing to their lower award rate. So what we've found for this new analysis is that there were 6 ICs that received 35% of the applications from African Americans. 5 of these 6 ICs had R01 rates that were below the average, and of course topics contribute as well. But the conclusion here is that the differential award rates, rather than the decision made by peer reviews, were critical driving factors. And the good news about this is that it provides a new potential target for intervention, meaning after the review, that final stage that is being made at the institute level, at council level, may provide some opportunities for intervention. But the fact of the matter is that despite all of these analyses, we do still have a gap. And I'm showing you this here because the success rate in that early Ginther report, which looked at FY 2000, 2006, and now even more recently, we're seeing these differences in awards rates. The differential success rate was 0.58. If there's no difference, it will be 1. And see, it's now moved to 0.063. So that is statistically significant at narrowing, but certainly the gap still exists. So we have to draw upon all of our tools to say, what can we do to urgently close this gap? And I'm showing you this data because I think it's really telling. This is data of differential success rate from FY19. And what you can see here on the top line is the number of applications, just 515 from Black applicants. And of those, nearly a half are discussed. So they scored well enough to be discussed. 62 were awarded. And the discussion rate was then 43%. And the overall success rate was 12%. And if you look at the success rate of those discussed, it was 28%. This is in contrast to white applicants who have applied thousands of applications, and their discussion rate is 56%, so there's a gap already there. The success rate is 24%, big gap there, and then in the discuss rate as well. And I'd like to do these thought experiments. So what this means to me is that there is a substantial number of qualified applications to fund, so, and 223 to be precise. So what if we had parity in both the discussed and the funding rate? Let's say it was the same for white applicants that it was for Black. That would result in an 121 awards to Black applicants, which means 59 additional awards. And if we had parity just among the discussed at 42%, that would result in 94 funded awards and 32 additional awards. And these approaches would actually close the gap fully. And so I'm urging us to think about not only what reviewers can do, but what can be done at the later stages in funding. In fact, I put this next slide up to show you that this work has been going on since 2016, 2 years after I got here. We identified 3 key areas where interventions could be positioned: submissions, making sure that we're getting more submissions from African American applicants; at review, coming up with strategies to ameliorate this lower or less favorable scores that African American applicants get; and then funding at the IC level. And here are a number of approaches. Mentoring, we now know that coaching and mentoring for grant writing, the work that has been done in the National Mentoring Network, is really paying off big time. There is an article in press in PLOS ONE showing that participants in those programs are actually getting their grants funded. And perhaps that's what's contributing to the narrowing of the K awards that I showed you, that gap, as well as the R01 funding. There's always the elephant in the room. Is this problem due to bias in peer review or bias at any stage? And CSR has done a marvelous study, which will be published this year, I believe, of an anonymization and pointing to what the impact of anonymization of grants can do in terms of funding. Very difficult to fully anonymize, but there's some hope there. And then finally, around this area of pay lines and what ICs can be doing. So this brings me nicely into the core presentation, which is the issue of implicit bias and its impact on all of this work, not only funding, but actually inclusion and that sense of isolation that many faculty who are from underrepresented racial ethnic groups and women feel. One of the consequences of there being so few is this minority tax, that added burden of mentoring, serving on committees, doing the service work, which is less recognized in the core systems for reward, like promotion, tenure, etc., etc. So these faculty find themselves doing this work and spending less time on their science. And when it comes to these decisions, they are ultimately penalized. Harassment is another problem. Worries about fulfilling stereotypic expectations. You will find that a lot of faculty who are from these underrepresented groups feel this. It's called stereotype threat. And that sense of anxiety actually contributes to lowering of performance. And then finally, there is this feeling of others are watching. There's this hypervigilance to errors and being in the spotlight. And if you would want to read just one article on bias, I would recommend this recent one by Rachel Roper, which actually lays out very nicely bias and how it occurs in all of the ranges of areas that affect the scientific workforce. In diversity, hiring and promotions, peer review, grading of faculty by students. This is one that is often forgotten. Women and people from underrepresented groups are incorrectly downgraded by their students, and this can affect their trajectory, etc. Respect, salaries, institutions, and then also inpatient care. And Dr. Roper concludes that while most faculty and scientists believe that they are fair and unbiased, numerous well-designed studies published in leading peer-reviewed journals show that gender bias, and here I would add racial bias as well, in science and medicine is widespread and persistent. So let me talk to you a little bit about bias and its pervasiveness. This is just a collage to show you that this bias occurs in so many walks of life. And it's rooted in stereotypes and begins very early in life. And this is an old slide, which I've resisted retiring, and probably I should retire, but it's an old experiment where psychologists have gone to grade school and they've asked the students to draw a scientist. And what the vast majority, over 50%, draw is the stereotypic Einstein figure. Unfortunate, because Einstein actually was one of the great activists and one of the great inclusive persons in his time. But that's the stereotype that we have in our mind. But the disconcerting thing is when they go up to higher grades, 3rd grade, 5th grades, the percentage drawing the stereotype is even greater. And more recent work has shown that by the age of 6, girls have internalized this feeling and is less likely than boys to view their own gender as brilliant. And I'm often asked, well, those are old experiments, Hannah. What's happened? And if you follow this draw a scientist experiment, they have been repeated. And yes, the percentage that are drawing women as scientists have increased, 28% from more recent studies. But that change is far too slow. We've got to figure out a way to change things more rapidly. And that stereotype still exists. And how do I know that stereotype exists? Look at this more recent experiment that was done in 2015, where the researchers took actual photographs from faculty websites, and they asked students to grade them for masculinity and femininity on a scale from 1 to 7. And sometimes these pictures were women, and of course, sometimes they were men. And then, as the consummate scientists that they were, they took another group of students and asked them to grade individuals here as to whether they were more likely to be a scientist or a teacher. And you can imagine the results. When the images were women, there was this inverse relationship between masculinity and femininity and the likelihood of being scientists. So the more feminine, the less likely the student said that this person was a scientist. And conversely, the more feminine, the more likely she was graded as a teacher. And for men, no such relationship. And these researchers concluded that feminine women were judged less likely to be a scientist. And by now, I bet you are thinking, what a frivolous experiment. I hope taxpayers' dollars do not go to do this. But it actually isn't that frivolous, because these biases affect our decisions. And here's a study in 2012 that went viral when resumes were sent to a nationwide sample of professors, people who think themselves as very objective, right? And they were asked to evaluate these materials for a lab manager position. And the content of these resumes were absolutely identical, except sometimes it was a woman's name and sometimes it was a man's name. And this graph below here showed you that the grading in terms of competency, hireability, and whether or not they would mentoring was always lower for the female named resume than the male named resume. And they also offered lower salary. So these biases actually do matter because they affect our behavior. And they affect our behaviors in the context of healthcare as well. And there was a wonderful book written by a colleague, Augustus White from Harvard, who's put together a lot of these studies to show that subconscious stereotyping does influence doctor-patient interactions. And even a more recent book that makes the link between these biases and health disparities and asks the question, well, if we had concordance between physicians and their patients in terms of race, would we actually diminish the bias and result in better care for patients. Here is a very old study from my own field, which when this study was published way back there in 1999, I was not involved at all in this area of diversity and inclusion. But what these researchers did was they took a classical script of a patient having angina, which is the classical symptom that might reflect a coronary artery disease and the narrowing significantly that would prompt a physician to refer a patient for coronary angiography. And they took these scripts and they got the scripts to be performed by actors. And sometimes the actors were Black women, sometimes they were white women, sometimes Asian men, sometimes, etc. And they took these video clips to a medical meeting, and they got attendees, physicians, to watch the videos and to then answer the question, are you likely to refer this person for a coronary angiogram? And as you can see here, Black women were the least likely to be referred, even though the scripts were absolutely identical. And I think this was some of the earlier evidence for this effect. A more recent study from an institution not too far of us indicating that approximately 50% of medical students and residents believe that Black patients feel less pain, are more likely, and were therefore more likely to suggest inappropriate treatments for Black patients. And notice that there were similar findings for Black students and residents holding these same stereotypes. And what is the science behind it? Dan Kahneman, famous Nobel Prize winner psychologist, offers these ideas for us, that these mental shortcuts are caused by overweighing evidence, ignoring baselines, and only recalling certain aspects of the information. And that leads to these biased decisions. And he has put it together very nicely in this dual system, system 1 and system 2, with system 1 being the automatic, fast, unconscious systems that are triggered through our stereotypes, and they are activated when we're busy. He calls it cognitive busyness, when we're distracted, when there's time pressure, for example, trying to make a rapid decision of a hiring decision. And then on the other hand, we have system 2, which is the more deliberate decisions involved. And this usually triggered when we are making important decisions that are of personal relevance. And despite the fact that system 1 is very efficient, we have to use it. We have to be cautious, because that is the genesis of the errors in our decision making. So the psychologists have tried to categorize these types of cognitive biases for us. And I think even those of us who are not researchers in this field, it behoves us to have some framework of understanding these so that we can pick them up in various settings in which we work. So there is what's called the conformational bias, which is this bias that confirms our own biases and leads us to certain decisions, that in-group biases favoring people like ourselves. The halo effect or the Matthew effect, this is particularly important in science. When we give credit based on past performance rather than what the evidence is present in front of you. And I mentioned that wonderful anonymized study that CSR has done. And I think what you will see there is this Matthew effect very clearly. And there is research, I'm not going to go through each of these, but there's research and papers published on each of these areas indicating and supporting these phenomena that actually exist and exist in our own areas of science. And so it behoves us to think about these. So I've talked to you a little bit about bias, how it comes about, the science, but what can we do about it? And before I transition into that, if you haven't heard of the implicit association test, I urge you to take it and just go online and Google IAT, Implicit Association Test, Project Implicit. And there are many of these tests that you can take in your own privacy of your home to see where the areas that you are biased. And let me tell you, you will be surprised in the areas that you are biased. I myself have done them, and I was quite amazed at my own results. So what can we do about bias? Well, we can raise awareness, which is partly what I'm doing right now. Does it make a difference? Yes. The data shown here with asterisk is research showing that raising awareness together with tools can actually modify behaviors, especially in the context of decision makings like hiring. Broadening the images of success simply by having pictures of counter stereotypes on the walls when you're making the decision can make a difference. Being consistent in judgment and evaluation criteria in the context of a search committee, for example. Setting out the criteria ahead of time rather than looking into the applications and modifying the requirements based on what you're already seeing. Avoiding ambiguity and time pressure. This sounds like a small thing, but the evidence suggests that it is huge and it is a major trigger of bias. And then finally, practicing speaking up when bias is perceived. And I would say that this is the most difficult. Even myself, who have been doing this work for 15 years, very often I'm in a committee meeting and I detect something that might be, I might interpret as bias. And it's not until I'm 10 minutes outside of the meeting and I say, gosh, I wish I'd said something. And to mitigate that, it is important to actually know the literature around it. And I think that any talk of this type would be incomplete without this absolute pioneering work, which actually is what brought my attention and many others to the importance of bias and the fact that we can make a difference. This was in the context of hiring concert musicians. And it was found that when these auditions were done behind screens, and especially if people were asked to take off their shoes so that they couldn't hear the clicking of the heels of the women, that resulted in tremendous increase in the numbers of women musicians hired. But what is the equivalent of that in our own field? And I think we've all struggled to get that. We have, when I was at Stanford, I had a study which ultimately was published of this raising awareness approach, where I gave this, had this presentation that was a half an hour of all of the literature of bias to the community. And what I did was, I would say that I actually biased the experiment myself, because I did not give the presentation myself. I asked the department chairs to give the presentation to their faculty. And actually assuming that their voices would be more readily heard than mine. And you can see that we measured the IAT pre and post, and we saw a diminution. And we concluded that this approach was effective, but I was always asked, well, how long does this effect last? And we now know that it doesn't last very long, certainly not more than 6 months. So rather like a vaccine, I think this requires booster shots to be done just at the time when you're embarking on a search. Now, my colleague at the University of Wisconsin, Molly Carnes, has taken this work even further when done a randomized controlled trial in several departments in her institution. Some got the intervention and some were in the control arm. And then she has actually looked at the rates of hiring. And here is some of Dr. Khan's data, comparing the control with the experimental, and she showed that increased rates of hiring of women, increased rates of hiring of non-white faculty, and increased rates of hiring of underrepresented racial ethnic groups. So I think there is good evidence for us to continue this work. And in fact, we have just developed online modules to educate about implicit bias that have come on at NIH. So what do we do in the context of a research committee? Be very clear, be very consistent. If there's a benefit of the doubt, make sure that everyone gets the benefit of the doubt, and be aware of shifting standards. Be ready to raise the question of bias when you see it happen in real time. And this work comes from Joan Williams, who has written really extensively about bias interrupters. But you really have to have some framework of what kinds of biases exist, right? So Joan has very clearly put together some categories of bias. Prove it again. And this is where you see women and people of color being asked for more evidence. And as an bias interrupter, you might say, well, why are we changing the criteria? I didn't hear you asking for all of this for the last candidate we looked at. The tightrope bias. This is where women violate their social norms, which is to be demure and to be not questioning and not assertive. And when we are assertive, we are interpreted as aggressive. And when you see that happen, you can be ready to say something about that. Mothers are actually also at risk, and very often people think they're actually doing a good thing. For example, well, I didn't think you'd want the job now that you have 2 children and all. And so if you hear that, you can interrupt and say, well, this person actually takes care of what is important, despite the fact that she might have children. This kind of bias is sometimes referred to as benevolent sexism, abbreviated as BS, and sort of, just be aware of that, and the tug of war bias as well. So here are just some guides about taking the bias out of the hiring process. I talked a lot about that, identifying using the tools which my office has developed to identify candidates from different backgrounds, being cognizant of the importance of outreach and that the recruitment begins before the position is already available. Don't expect that underrepresented groups will just respond to an ad. Create those relationships before you have your position and then invite them to apply. Making sure that committees are diverse while avoiding the diversity tax. The diversity tax, very important. When I started this work at Stanford 15 years ago, the first thing I did on day one was said, every search committee, faculty search committee will have a person from a racial ethnic underrepresented group, until I realized that all 25 of us at the time will be spending our lives on search committees. So I quickly changed that to say either a woman or an underrepresented person, a racial ethnic group. And I've already spoken to the importance of having adequate time, articulating the reasons, and also having structured interviews. So when we put it all together, you can see that the NIH approach that has been in place for the last 5 or 6 years is an integrated approach that draws on many areas. So hiring, we set up the Distinguished Scholars Program, which was designed to build a self-reinforcing community of principal investigators committed to diversity and inclusion. Notice the definition and the criteria. There is not a mention of race there, but when we do this, we see that it is enriched for diversity as depicted in this picture here and as depicted in the data shown here. Here is the representation of underrepresented racial ethnic groups. Essentially, it's Hispanic and African American throughout time. Broad searches, trans NAEHS searches have contributed to enhancing the diversity. But then look at the complete reversal or increase that turned the corner with the Distinguished Scholars Program. And we expect that that will be continue to be the case. We're now up to close to 14% of our tenure track investigators are from these underrepresented groups. Because that has been so successful, we've rolled it out to become a program for the extramural institutions funded through the Common Fund. A funding announcement will be going out sometime in October, where NIH will be partnering with the institutions to support the startup funds, will provide funds to change the institutional culture, for like mentoring, work-life issues, and all of that. And I hope, but the core of this will be this cohort model of hiring, where a cohort of assistant professors, anything from 6 to 10, will be hired within an institution geared to changing the culture. I've talked about trans NAEHS searches and implicit bias mitigation. And of course, the core of this is that you must have transparency, accountability, and tracking. And I think any institution who is committed to this work can do this. We've set it up for the NIH Intramural Committee called the NIH Equity Committee. And core representatives are from NIEHS because they've been so successful at doing this. And it's always a pleasure to have each of the institutes come and present. And when NIEHS Intramural presents, the other institutes actually begin to learn from them. And then National Mentoring Network. And then finally, let me just share with you some reflections about social injustice and where we find ourselves at this point with the recent killings of unarmed Black people in society. That is not new, but it's really been drawn significant attention to in the last couple of months, such that the editor-in-chief of Science wrote this compelling brief article, Time to Look in the Mirror. And the point here is, yes, this social injustice affects all walks of life, but we in science have to look in our backyard and correct what we can correct. The other aspect of this is that since then, there's been an outpouring of publications from faculty who are African American, who have succeeded and are highly successful despite this, the impacts of racism in their career paths, and they've written about it. And there's a sense of exhaustion as depicted on the right-hand side. We're worn, we're tired, we're mustering up just enough energy to make it through. So I co-chair the advisory committee to the director's working group on diversity. And we have been thinking about this issue, and I'll share with you in a moment, but I just wanted to share with you some very basic classifications of racism, which I think we should all know and have at our fingertips. And so Kamara Jones has been writing about this since 2000. She defines this as institutionalized racism, which is the differential access to goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. And we know what that means. Personally mediated racism, which is the one I think that most people think about. And it's that police brutality, physician disrespect, driving while Black, all of that. And then there is this internalized racism. This is actually one that is really important. That is the victimized actually internalizing these ideas and always striving to achieve and overcome these racial barriers, which is a survival skill needed, but results in exhaustion, results in physical and mental health problems. And that is why, if you look at well-educated Blacks, socially affluent Blacks, their rates of mortality, their heart disease, cancer rates are worse than poor white people in this country. Remarkable, and it's referred to as the allostatic load, and it's something that NIH, I'm sure, will be studying extensively. So this ACD working group has been thinking about it, and I just wanted to share just a few highlights to openly acknowledge the problem of anti-Black racism in science. Yes, this racism affects other racial groups, but there is something specific that is related to the history of Black people, not only in this country actually, but across the world. Promoting community-based research being done by the people who've actually experienced this is something that this group is calling for. Support for our Black peers at this time of emotional turmoil, looking at those criteria that have become the norm for selecting and asking the question, can we look at this in different ways and have more holistic approaches? For example, in the grants decisions, as I outlined for you, monitoring and reporting acts of racial bias with the same purpose and the same precision as we have taken for sexual harassment. There is a call to action for us to be as aggressive about this. And most importantly is the last bullet here, empowering our allies to be not only not racist, to be actively anti-racist. And that's the kind of support that I feel that I've been getting from the NAEHS intramural group. The NIH leadership has embraced this. There's a lot of work going on. We've had 4 IC directors meeting dedicated just to this topic. You know, our leadership is really committed to addressing this issue. So we will see emerging key working groups. I think there's 5 of them, trans NIH, to address this, in addition to all of the work that individual ICs are doing. There is more aggressive work to address the residual racial gaps in R01 grants, which I have already talked about. And Rick, I know, is highly committed to this and is working in that area. Learning about what this racism is. We've already had workshops on this, and we're going to continue to have a lecture series. And those of you who are from external, I would encourage you to do this. Learning and listening, active listening to the people that are affected, I think, is the first step. I mentioned we are having mandatory implicit bias training for NIH staff. It's already launched. And then monitoring and reporting to the a central committee like the NIH Equity Committee, and perhaps even establishing new awards to assess for health disparities. And so let me just summarize that it's been a great pleasure doing this work. I've been felt extremely well supported, even though a lot of my talk here has been about this feeling of not being supported. I think my experience at NIH has been just remarkable in terms of the support that I have had. But what I've learned is that contrary to the usual saying that great minds think alike, I'd like to leave you with this thought that actually great minds think differently. And if we can engage that difference in the great minds and get them to the table, we will be really enriching our research and the health and the care and the translation of the discoveries into health. So I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll hand it over to Rick.
Anna, that was just fabulous. So thank you so much. Hopefully you will reconsider whether you're going to be leaving us or not. You still have a few days. So let me, I have a number of questions, but I'm going to save my questions. I want to open this up to members of our council. So let's see.
I have, Rick, I have one hand up, but I also have a comment in the chat box from Jalon. Dr. White, did you want to ask your question, or would you like me to read it for you? Read it out.
Why don't you have her ask the question?
Yeah.
Oh boy, I mean, first of all, Dr. Hannah, thank you. I mean, I have like 25 questions and comments, but I think the one you were referring to is really, I was interested in being the mom of 2 girls and trying to kind of push science and acceptance. And, you know, sometimes when you don't really see yourself as a scientist or see yourself as an engineer because you don't have those people to look at. And so I was just wondering, I think with the Draw a Scientist experiment that you talked about, had they expanded to include folks not only gender-wise, but from various racial and ethnic backgrounds to see, again, what the outcomes were?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Yes, there is tremendous work on that as well, and you can imagine those results show that you know, Black people are less likely to be thought of as a scientist in the same way as the Draw a Scientist experiment for women, even more so. So, and there are some anecdotes about that in the literature as well. So yeah, those stereotypes are deeply ingrained as to who is a scientist. And so there's a lot of work to be done there as well. For not only for the others, I call them the gatekeepers, but also for the individuals to have confidence in yourself that you can do it and you will do it, I think it's really important work that needs to get done. So thank you for your question.
Next question, Bob, right.
Hi, Dr. Valentine. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I was particularly struck by the paper you talked about, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his or her name correctly, Hoppy et al., about the topics that African-American unrepresented minority applicants study are considered less important by NIH. I'm curious for what those topics are and whether or not, you know, there's so much subjectivity in what is considered important. And I wonder if actually we need to listen and think about whether those really are the important topics. And perhaps that's actually something where we could make a difference through RFAs and other ways to encourage those topics. And I just wonder if there's anything like that happening at NIH.
Yeah, thank you for your question. This is really an important issue. And those topics, if you look at the figures where health disparities, minority health, women's health, actually. And when you looked at it though, topic choice per se, the contribution in the new analysis was less significant than the award rate of the institute, which is not to say the topic choice doesn't matter. There is definitely, I would say, a hierarchy of the topics that are funded within NIH. I don't think that people will argue on that. And it calls for action to look at, for every institute, to look at its portfolio. You know, the work to be done on health disparities and minority health should not be viewed just as the work for NIMHD, for the Minority Health Institute, but it should be in the portfolio of all institutes. So I would say institutes have to just look at their portfolio, broaden it to make sure that those topics are being covered, and to make sure that there is a diversity of their grantees as well, and have a sort of a holistic approach to the funding ultimately.
It's prominent in our strategic plan.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
Yes,
NAEHS leading the way as usual.
Let's get other questions.
Yeah, Dr. Goldman, I think you were next in line.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, a couple of comments, and one is that I had the good luck when I was at Hopkins to have a small grant that allowed us to have high school students from the local high school where all the students were Black, only about 2 blocks away from that huge medical complex. We'd bring them in for the summer, and what I remember so vividly is how a couple of them told me they would look at our buildings and look at the people going in and out and never imagine that they belonged inside other than as patients. And after spending a summer with us, they understood they were as smart as the people who worked in there. And I think that is just so important early on to give kids that opportunity to learn that about themselves, because they don't imagine themselves working inside of any kind of science institutions. And at the beginning, they were kind of, maybe I would be a lawyer or in sports. They could imagine that. They couldn't imagine being scientists. But the other thing I wanted to say, you know, for years and years, we have struggled with this issue of environmental justice and how to incorporate those issues into risk assessment. And frankly, you know, there have been efforts again and again to say, look, that racism is having an impact on health, that so-called social determinants, of which racism is one, are important. But in environmental health, we have never formally been able to put that into our models for assessing risk. If racism were a toxin, it would be, we would consider that toxic agent to be more potent than almost anything else that we work on, right? Yeah. When you look at what the impacts are on health across so many health problems, and we can quantify that now. I think that we are developing the biology around how racism is making a negative impact on health. I think we consider it to be an endocrine disruptor. I think that we consider it to be something that modifies us epigenetically, may have transgenerational epigenetic effects. Why can't we bring forth that science, you know, from our NAEHS and other institutes to be able to then, you know, translate that into, you know, real actions to be more protective of communities that are impacted by environmental exposures. And I mean, I just see a huge area of opportunity for the NAEHS and all of the people who are supported by the NAEHS, just as, you know, in my generation, it was about, well, let's look at age. Let's look at the impacts on children, right? But, and we're still needing to do that. Don't misunderstand me here, but we really have not considered, you know, either where it comes to race or other forms of discrimination. I am sure that some of the things that we think of as peculiarly health risks to women, why are rates of depression so high among women? Is that because I have an extra X chromosome and that makes me depressed? Or is some of my depression perhaps, or risk for depression, due to the discrimination that I've suffered, you know? And that kind of thing has, it's just been too easy for us to try to invoke our genes as the reason for these disparate risks, and because we really haven't wanted to look at racism, gender bias, and other sources of very real health stress on people. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. McAllister. You're absolutely correct. And I love your tagline, racism as a toxin. It is a toxin. And Rick will tell you that there's widespread NIH leadership discussion about the science of racism and how it affects health. And I sense from those meetings that many of the ICs are really thinking about what to do, what kind of science to begin to study. It is extraordinary, isn't it? This interface of this chronic stress that has been there for years. Actually, it's knowledge that goes beyond socioeconomic. The piece that I'm really intrigued about is that the socioeconomic gaps don't explain it all.
No, no way. And thank you, Dr. Valentine, for your wonderful presentation here today.
My pleasure.
I should have said that first.
No, I think you're right. We're going to see some exciting new research in this space coming up.
And I just want to do a time check. I mean, this is so great, your willingness to take questions. Do you have some extra time? You can take a few more questions, or do you need to
Yes,
run?
I do. Let me just check. Oh, absolutely. Yes, I do.
Well, Pat, I'd like to keep the Q&A going. I see that the chat box is filling up here.
Yep.
So-
Yeah. I agree. Let's. Our next questioner was Dr. Perez Lugo, and I'll pass it on to you, Marla.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Valentine, for your presentation. I have a question, maybe a request for help. Yesterday, we were watching a presentation about career grants, and one of the pictures of one of the cohorts looked very not diverse, and we asked for information about the racial and the ethnic distribution of applicants, and we were told that that information was stripped from the data by NIH, so we could not know what that distribution was. But the purpose, I understand the purpose of it to avoid the bias, but obviously it's not working. What would you recommend us to do?
This is the most difficult question because it gets to the core of the legal requirements. And yes, the race ethnicity information is kept separately, and we are all constantly reminded by our legal counsel that we mustn't take race into consideration. And yet I have a sense that somehow or other race is actually being taken into consideration. So what do? I'm stuck with that one, quite honestly. I tend to want to know myself, and there are ways of finding out, but I'm not going to, this is a public forum, I wouldn't say, but it is an extraordinary difficult thing. You will not get disaggregated racial data from NIH. It's just so prohibited. So I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer your question or give help, quite frankly.
This is an issue that NIH has been dealing with. I'm on the extramural program management committee, and it's a big discussion on several, and I was hoping you had the answer because we haven't figured it out yet.
No, but there's ways of finding out if you really want to find out.
Yeah.
Just to say that Anna has led a pretty robust discussion with the IC directors in many of our meetings, trying to get at the heart of this. It's a complicated question, but there's a lot of concern and a lot of interest in trying to address it. I don't know, is that a fair statement, Hannah?
I think that's correct. Very, very fair. But I would just add, if you really want to know, you can know. There's ways. It's not beyond our capability, and I think within this current climate, you have to use whatever tools you can.
All right, let's take at least a couple more questions. Dr. Ho, you're up. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Valentine. That was a fantastic talk, and it's really truly summarizing like all the questions that we have today. I have a very simple question. Basically, do you have data on other racial groups? And the reason I'm asking this is I'm always puzzled by the fact that NIH and other agencies will use two criteria. One is underrepresented minorities, and another is racial minorities. So the question I have is, do racial minorities in this country experiencing the same kind of toxin as the underrepresented minorities in this country? So this is something that we really have to open up and talk about that openly. we may not have answers. So maybe you may have data and NIH may be looking at that, and I will encourage the NIH will look at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your comments. And the answer is yes, we have data. And the data, I didn't have time to share everything, but the most important data is that is the certain gaps for Asian American scientists. So for example, if you look at the original Ginther report, 2011, the gap, the funding gap, the success rate gap was also present for Asian American applicants, not as severe as for Black applicants, but it was already there. And when they corrected for being native born, the gap narrowed, but it didn't completely go away. So that's evidence number one to speak to what you're talking about. Evidence number two is that as you go up along the career path to leadership, Asian Americans are severely underrepresented in leadership positions. I mean, severely. And NIH recognizes that and is working on that for the intramural program. And I would say that that is the case across the country. And so that gap needs to be recognized and corrected as well if we truly believe that this diversity of perspective is what we're after to enrich the science. So the way I'm looking at it is the diversity of the perspective, the inclusivity, and there is a significant issue about being Black in this country that needs a lot of attention.
Okay, thank you. Jose, Dr. Cordero, I have you up next.
Thank you. Again, thank you. This has been fabulous, and appreciate all the time you've taken. I'm just very, very impressed with the work that has been done. Sort of following up on what Amarla mentioned, I've been thinking a lot of how to have some kind of blinded type of review, just like what you were describing with musicians. And looking at NIH reviews, yeah, maybe possible to take names off, but there's this segment of environment that actually describes, you came from, let's say, Harvard, or you came from Puerto Rico, and that even if you want to hide it, it's there. And have you thought about or been any thinking in terms of how reviews could be done, let's say, somewhat blinded? I know it is hard. I've seen it done, and we're seeing it effectively done in some journal reviews and that I've been involved with. But your thoughts on moving in some direction and having some blinding evaluations?
So thank you for your comments, Jose. You're absolutely spot on, and the answer is yes. Our director for the Center for Scientific Review, Dr. Noni Burns, is particularly interested in this topic and is really working on how to do some, pilot studies in this arena in the wake of a very good study that her group ran, anonymizing applications from African Americans. It wasn't in real time. What they did was to take 400 applications from African American applicants, matched them with 400 applications from white applicants, and then then took a random sample of applications. And so they, first of all, tried to strip all of the identifiers, including institutions. Boy, it is very, very difficult. And in fact, at the end of the day, a large proportion of the time, people could actually guess correctly the race of the applicant. So that's challenge number one. But I don't think she's deterred. And once that paper is out, you will see what it shows. And NIH is really thinking about how to do this. Yeah, so that's what I said. It's a great idea. I don't know of any funding agency that has done it and done it well and published their results and so forth. So we'll probably take the lead on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're running way over. How about if we do one more question?
Yeah.
And can you hang on for another couple of minutes?
Sure.
Great.
I think Andy Shee had the next question, so Andy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Pat. Again, Dr. Valentine, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. We learned a lot from what you shared with us today. I'm just curious about whether or not NIH had looked at intersection of different kinds of factors that may lead to institutional bias and racism. I'm thinking particularly, you present the information on overlap between, for example, race and gender. What about race and gender and disability, for example? I'm thinking about this because, as you know, Ford Foundation, other Robert Johnson Foundation had recently made a concerted effort to look at their disability portfolio. And the approach they're taking is really reminiscent of the process that NIH is going through now, looking at racism and other social determinants. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for that. Actually, just early this year, first of all, you're absolutely right. In all of the work that I've done in the last 6 years, we really haven't been addressing disability, quite frankly. You know, this just been sort of, the scope of the work was just so enormous. That said, last year, we have a member on our advisory committee to the Directors Working Group on Diversity, who actually has taken this on and made a compelling presentation to this working group that indicated the lack of data, the distinct likelihood of being vastly underrepresented, more so than any racial ethnic groups, and to be discriminated and disadvantaged. So what we're doing now is to put up a subcommittee that will study this and make some recommendations as to how NIH should be moving forward with addressing disability, scientists with disabilities, and and making it more inclusive, like we've done for all the other groups. Now, the intersectionality is very, very important. We've seen that the intersectionality of race and gender makes things even worse. So if you're a Black woman, so of course that would be the next frontier to study the intersectionality within disability and race and disability and gender. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I have to concede this is an area where we have not done much work and needs a lot more work to be done.
So Hannah, before
we started,
we're going to be engaging in some pretty detailed discussions with Council. And you referred several times to the working group on diversity for the ACD. Are there any words of wisdom that you would want to leave us with that can help to nucleate some of our discussions about potentially how Council members could be more actively working together with leadership at the NIEHS to address issues of racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Any words of wisdom?
Well, I do think that a small group working on these issues is very important and focusing on a particular issue. And so, I mean, I think if you could get a subcommittee of your council dedicated to this, that will be, meeting not in their usual quarterly or whatever, but literally monthly with an excellent executive secretariat to capture the discussion and capture the outputs. I think this will result in a very fine set of recommendations to help inform your institute. I can already tell by the questions being asked here, you know, there might be some really interesting nuances that this group points to. For example, disability, the gap for Asian American scientists, and that kind of thing that, you know, is not being done adequately centrally.
Outstanding. Well, again, Hannah, I want to thank you for taking the time with us, and just on behalf of the entire council, this was totally enjoyable. And again, you left us with many provocative things to be thinking about.
Well, thank you again, and thank you.
And I hope you come back and visit with some regularity. Love to see you, not just virtually, but actually in person. You're always welcome here.
Well, thank you very much. You can invite me and I'll come.
Sounds good. We'll do it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Pat, I'll turn the podium back over to you. It looks like we have you up for your presentation.
Yeah, I'm kind of feeling sorry for the guy that has to follow that talk. So I'm going to try to, all right, with any luck, I'll be driving this slideshow here. Look at that. All right, this is the part of the council meeting where the director or acting director of DERT kind of goes over some things that are happening in the division just to kind of get you all up to date. We're going to do it a little bit differently this time. We usually have the director speaking for about an hour, about 45 minutes with questions, but I'm going to cut that portion of the talk down to about hopefully 15 or 20 minutes. And then I kind of want to turn it over to start our part of the discussion on racism and inclusion and diversity. So I want to start by going through, here's some of the topics I'll be talking about in this part of my session, my talk. So I'll be giving you a few staffing updates, which is always a fun thing to do. We'll talk about some of our COVID funding opportunity updates, and then a variety of DERT activities that I'll catch you up on, and then pivot to our discussion on racism and diversity. Let's see, can I do that? Yeah. So staffing updates, like I said, this is always one of our favorite parts. We're very happy to welcome 2 new members to DERT. First is Dr. Melissa Smar. She will be joining the Population Health Branch. She comes to us from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory, where she was an assistant professor of environmental health. She was involved in research related to environmental exposures in the context of endocrine disruption, reproductive, prenatal, maternal, and child health issues, especially in vulnerable populations. She also taught graduate courses in environmental justice and biomedical research ethics. Prior to that, she was a research fellow at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Here at DRT, she will be manage a portfolio dealing with metabolic syndrome, diabetes, obesity, and male reproductive health. Melissa, very welcome. Glad to have you. Our next new recruit we're proud and pleased to have is Sarah Amalegba. So I hope I got that right, Sarah. She comes to us after 10 years of experience in the health sciences and well as in research communications. She previously held positions as a biological lab tech, a research assistant, both in academia and industry, as well as a contract environmental health communication specialist. She'll be joining the health sciences research branch, specifically, more working with the Superfund part of the branch. And she will be involved in reviewing scientific manuscripts and stories for our communications, for our monthly reports, our website, and that kind of thing. And we'll be doing some analysis of scientific programs and maintaining some of our social media accounts and things like that. So Sarah, welcome. Glad to have you on board as well. Back in June, I outlined some of the COVID-related programs that DRT was going to be involved with. And I'd like to kind of give you an update on some of those now. Maybe. Not advancing. There we go. The first thing I want to mention is the Notice of Special Interest, or what we call a NOSI, that were released back in the spring. And the goal of this NOSI was to support research on understanding how environmental exposures would impact the COVID-19 pandemic by looking at things such as susceptibility, disease severity, and progression, and that kind of thing. When we released the NOSI, there were two types of awards included. Both were designed to get the awards out quickly, because this was kind of an emergency situation, while ensuring that we always were awarding the most meritorious research. So the two avenues we chose were to use supplemental awards that are supplemental to existing applications, and then our R21 time-sensitive program, which are new applications. And I'll describe those a little bit in the next several slides. Administrative supplements and competitive revisions are similar in that they provide supplemental funding to existing grants. The difference being that administrative supplements have to stay within the scope of the parent grant, but because of that, they can be reviewed internally by NIH, in this case, NIEHS staff. Competitive revisions are a little different in that they have to be related to the parent grant, but they can expand the scope of the parent grant a little bit. And for that reason, they're typically reviewed by regular study sections, just like new applications are. But these are actually what are called urgent competitive revisions. And this was a category that NIH developed several years ago during the spate of hurricanes we had one year. So that these can, if needed, be reviewed internally rather than by having to assemble a study section. We chose to review, as you'll see here, both of these types of awards with applications internally. We received over 60 applications, and they were proposing to supplement a whole variety of different kinds of mechanisms, as you can see. As I mentioned, they were reviewed internally by DERT personnel, but we had feedback from 5 DIR people that were very appreciative too: Don Cook, Mike Fessler, Stavros Garantsiotis, Steve Kleberger, and Stephanie London. Their input was invaluable to our decision making. We have not made all the awards yet, so we can't really talk about specifically what we have awarded. Hopefully we'll be able to do that at a later meeting. But in terms of the topics we received, we got applications that were interested in looking at environmental exposures, again, on the susceptibility, spread, or regression of COVID disease. Some proposals to develop educational, community-based, and other public health strategies related to COVID. Proposals to study the impact of environmental health disparities on the spread of the disease, and some more basic proposals looking at multi-omics approaches to identify biomarkers and metabolic signatures related to infection. And finally, mostly from the Superfund program, we received some proposals to looking at design and engineering of more effective PPE. In terms of new awards, as I say, we used our time-sensitive R21 program. This has been around for several years now. We use it as it's intended for emerging research opportunities, often related to natural disasters and things like that. So we invited applications around the COVID coronavirus pandemic. These, as I say, need to be reviewed by peer review, and they were reviewed by our scientific review bench through special emphasis panels convened by Janice Allen, Laura Thomas, and Leroy Worth, with assistance from Deborah Jones, Kendra Morrison, and Sharmise Alton. We received 66 applications as of September 9th, and these included applications that were received as recently as September 1. I should have noted earlier, we put in a monthly receipt dates starting in May of 2020, the beginning of every month, going through May of next year. So we'll continue to receive these applications and look at them and make funding decisions. The topics we received for these applications included the role of air pollution in COVID disease, a very unique approach to looking at wastewater to monitor COVID in community areas. This is a tool that had been used by other institutes for looking at like drug use in a particular area. We have proposals to look at the mental health aspects of the pandemic related to stay-at-home orders. And then finally, to look at the impact of health disparities on COVID. Again, we don't have the full, we can't tell you everything that's going to be awarded because we're still working on that. I will tell you that we initially set aside $2.75 million for this NOSI. not including what would be contributed by the Superfund research program. We will probably end up spending more than that because we've got a lot of good awards. I've got a lot of good applications. But right now for this year, we're hoping to fund 8 to 10 supplements and revisions, as well as 3 of the time-sensitive R21s. We consider this to have been a fairly successful program so far and looking forward to continuing it into next fiscal year. The other large coronavirus program that we developed was developed by our worker training program dealing with virtual safety training in response to COVID-19. The worker training program really jumped into action early in the pandemic, probably before it was even declared a pandemic, frankly. They mobilized their extensive network of federal and non-federal partners and had held a lot of meetings and seminars and developed a variety of unique and highly effective online resources very early on. Worker training program, of course, was created to provide training to workers who are at risk for hazardous exposures in their job. Initially, this dealt mostly with chemical or radiation hazards, but over the years, the program has also expanded to support development of training for exposures to biological hazards such as anthrax, flu, mold remediation after hurricanes, Ebola, and now currently coronavirus. In response to the need to protect frontline essential workers from COVID virus, Congress gave the worker training program $10 million as part of the Coronavirus Preparedness Response Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2020 to develop the necessary training. The objectives of the initiative were to identify evidence-based methods to prevent exposure, to create a virtual platform for delivering the training. Remember, they're under lockdown during this time too. And then to build, of course, the cadre of trainers to implement these programs. This is a very brief overview of how the money was spent. The FOA for the worker training program is released every 5 years. So we make competing awards every 5 years, and we're just fortunate that this is on the 5-year cycle. So we were able to add $3.7 million to these competing awards to enhance the coronavirus training aspects. But in addition, the worker training program released a NOC for a supplement, what are called emergency supplements. And we're able to make 14 of these supplemental awards for a total of $1.8 million. You can see below how the funds are being used for essential training, and for returning workers, and by providing training tailored for specific worker populations. And again, using a hybrid in-person, online, remote training methodology to get the training out. Going forward, there's still a little of the, some of the $10 million left, and they're working on a proposal right now to release another NOC that will include more input from communities that are more affected by the coronavirus by partnering them with worker training grantees. As before, these will be administrative supplements, and the plan still under development, but we hope to release the NOC very soon and plan to award 7 to 10 supplements for a total of about $3.5 million to continue this valuable research. I'm not mentioning here other efforts that we participated in, including the RADx UP program, which is a trans NIH program, where our staff were points of contact related to social behavioral grants, and as well as pregnant women and children's health programs. So periodically, as you're aware, we join programs that are led by other ICs or other at NIH or other federal agencies. We like to keep council updated on these. Today, I want to give you a brief overview of a proposed program that's being led by NCI that has been approved by their council to be out soon, that we would like to participate in. The program is called, as you can see, New Cohorts to Assess Environmental Exposures and Cancer Risk. The goal of the program is to research gaps in our understanding of how environmental exposures, genetics, and other factors influence cancer etiology. It will look at exposures not addressed in other NCI cohorts and will support research on health disparities as well. They propose to support about 5 new prospective cohorts, as well as a coordinating center. This is going to be done using a fairly unique 2-phase grant mechanism that's fairly new to NIH, the UG3 UH3 mechanism. As the U implies, it's a cooperative agreement mechanism, meaning that there will be a substantial involvement by NIH staff. I think A.B. Boyles will be our point of contact for this. At least she's the one that sent me the slide, so I assume it's A.B. The first part, or the UG3 phase, is more preparatory phase, where awardees need to demonstrate that they can do the recruitment and collect the data and basically can do the research that they propose. After they're evaluated for that information, then they can receive the UH3 phase of the grant, which is really where most of the research will be done. You can see here that NCI proposes to, you can see the amount that NCI proposes to invest on the cohorts as well as on the coordinating center. We haven't worked out our contribution yet. We're still looking at budgetary factors for the upcoming year and so forth, but we will be involved. The RFA is they plan on releasing it fairly soon in January, for a January receipt date. And finally, as we typically do, I want to talk about some events that our staff have been involved with since the previous council meeting, as well as some upcoming events. In addition to our participation virtually, of course, in the ISEE and the age-dependent changes in cancer biology meetings, we held 3 program-related meetings, the programs being our core centers, our ONES program, and our PRIME program, which looks at mixtures exposure. And this year we had a unique thing where the worker training program put together a summer webinar series, and they covered a number of issues, including COVID in the workplace as well as racism. They were very well attended. I was able to listen to just 2 or 3 of them, and they were very well done. Going forward, we have a few meetings and events that we will point out that our staff are involved with. Some are related to our programs, such as a GeoHealth, worker training, and again, the PRIME program, as well as the Environmental Mutagenesis Society meeting and the Environmental Epidemiology of Autism meeting. If you have any questions about these meetings, where they're going to be, and details, please let us know, and we'll make sure that you will hear about them in due time. There we go. All right, I want to turn now to focus on the main topic for our meeting this week. Racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the environmental health science research work area. I'm going to be honest, this has been a fairly challenging thing to prepare for this meeting, and I appreciate all the help that I've gotten from our DERT staff on this. This has certainly been a group effort. Part of the challenge, as we've heard from Dr. Valentine, and as we know, is that it's a very broad and a multifactorial topic, dealing with, in our case, everything from hiring practices to educational opportunities. And we'll discuss here a little bit later who gets awarded grants. Choosing this title slide was even difficult. I could have put a lot more nouns in here to cover the whole topic if we needed to. But of course, it's also a difficult topic to talk about. Federal agencies and universities, businesses have been thinking about this for some time, but the events starting with George Floyd's death back on Memorial Day weekend have forced the country, and rightly so, forced us to face the issue of racism that's still in the country. As Rick pointed out yesterday, we spent a lot of time and energy at NIHS over the summer talking about this as an institute and in individual divisions, including DERT. It's of course a painful topic for many people, and from what I'm seeing, it's an uncomfortable topic for just about everyone. And these things can be impediments to the kind of open discussion that we want to have today and that we need to start and keep going. And I hope that we can be as free and open in the discussion today as we need to be, not just about racism, but other issues such as sexism, homophobia, and other biases and prejudices. I think we need to deal with the fact that this has been around for such a long time and so deeply rooted and is so pervasive, affecting so many aspects of what we do. But the nature of racism has changed over the years to where, in addition to the more overt aspects, it has a more insidious component now, and is therefore in many cases more difficult to identify and to roll out. It's kind of, to torture an analogy here, it's like woven into the fabric of our red tape here. We need, there may be biases that we don't even know about that we need to explore. And I'm hoping that we can talk about this today and get some information from you all and some ideas about how we can root out and identify and root out these biases. And on a practical level, sorry, there we go. On a practical level, this presents a challenge to know how to limit our discussion today. We only have a limited amount of time at this meeting. This will hopefully be going on in future meetings. And so we decided we had to think about how to delineate the topics for today. So what we decided was to focus on these two topics here. And I'll come back to what they are in just more detail in just a second, but these are enhancing the environmental health science workforce, diversity, and trying to understand and address the funding gap that Dr. Valentine mentioned earlier. So for the next little while, you'll hear a presentation from me and some other of our direct staff about some issues and some programs we have going. The information we present is not meant to offer any finished solutions, but really to seed the discussion that will happen afterwards. And that is the most important part of the day today. We'll be presenting some limited data, but we're asking that if you have any other data that you would like to see that we can get, we will be glad to go mining for that and analyze it as best we can, given the resources we have. And again, I want to emphasize that this is the beginning of an ongoing discussion, as Rick alluded to yesterday in his report, and we'll be discussing this at future council meetings as well. So for the purpose of the presentation, we'll be looking at these two specific overlapping topics. We'll spend most of our time talking about efforts to increase diversity in the EHS workforce. However challenging this may be, it may be the least challenging and most tractable task we have in front of us, kind of part of the low-hanging fruit that someone asked about yesterday. But as Rick alluded to, it's just not enough to get the numbers up. We also have to develop a culture that will be more welcoming to the people we bring into our fold. And then I want to spend some time talking, broaching the subject on how to deal with this racial disparity funding gap that we've talked about. Typically, when we ask council for a discussion like this, we like to present with questions. I sent these to you a couple of days ago, and hopefully you've had time to look about these and think about them. We'll be touching on these questions during the talks as we go forward today, and we'll present these again at the end of the talks before we start on the discussion. As I referred to earlier, this is really a broad topic, and we've chosen to focus today on the two issues I mentioned. We've also chosen, just for today now, not to address the important issue of research related to health disparities and environmental justice. I want to make it clear this does not in any way suggest that this is not an important topic. On the contrary, we want to make sure we give the topic adequate time for discussion. So we decided to defer this to a later meeting. You can see from this, well, maybe you can't see from this diagram here, these each represent programs that NAEHS has supported in the area of community-based research, which include environmental justice and environmental health disparities. And we've had a long and robust history supporting this stuff, this research. And as Rick mentioned earlier, NIHS is working on internal efforts to address research questions related to health and ethnicity. But again, in the interest of giving the topic adequate time for discussion, we'll defer this to a later meeting. Excuse me. One more thing I would like to ask is that we move forward with our presentations. If you have questions, unless they're just small clarifying questions, we ask that you hold them until we get to the discussion later, just in the interest of time and getting a full discussion. This graph shows basically what Dr. Valentine showed in her presentation. This is the top half of a graph, and I'll show the lower half later. It shows that the percentage of African American students in U.S. colleges is about the same as is represented in the overall population of the U.S. But when you look at the percentages of doctorates, African Americans who represented the total number of earned doctorates, it's only about 6%. And when you look specifically at doctorates related to biological and biomedical sciences, the number goes down to 3%. So the question is, what happens between here and here? And how can we influence getting more students, more college students to go into the biomedical sciences, specifically, in our case, into the environmental health sciences? How do we get them interested and keep them on board? I don't think I need to spend much time on this. Dr. Valentine very well outlined the value of diversity. It's not just an issue of fairness, which of course it is, but it's also important because it has been shown that increasing diversity of opinions and perspectives, bring those to a project or a question, lead to more creative solutions and more productivity. Or as stated in our NIEHS strategic plan, the diversity of thought, perspectives, and approaches is critical to maximizing the public health impact of EHS research and translation efforts. Dr. Jackson provided an example yesterday during her talk of how diversity can help, perspectives can help in a situation. So as Dr. Valentine said, this is the why now. What we need to move on to now is the how. So I want to draw your attention to these two overarching themes, things I would like you to be thinking about as we move forward. Basically, the age-old human resources mantras of recruitment and retention. In our case, recruitment means, among other things, identifying the talented people early in their educational professional experiences and getting them interested in doing environmental health science research. Then providing them the opportunities for them to enter the field, such as training opportunities or other career opportunities. Retention involves mentoring them to help them facilitate their movement through their careers. For us at NIH, that can mean helping them through the world of grants, especially at times of career transition, such as getting a postdoc fellowship or a K99R00 award. We'll hear more about this later, but in order for us to do this, of course, we have to develop procedures for better tracking and better following our trainees through their careers. So at this point, I would like to turn the virtual podium over to some of my colleagues at DRT to discuss some of our specific training and training-related programs and how these can be used to try to enhance our diversity. I'm going to start by turning it over to Mike Humble, who gives a brief overview, and then he'll turn it over to some of our other colleagues. So, John, if you can give control to Mike. Mike, I will be ready to go.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Good morning, everybody. Let's see if I have control here. So I'll lead off our presentations this morning, really looking at our training and related programs that are really focused on increasing or enhancing the diversity of our environmental health workforce. And I'm not getting these to change slides.
Mike, I found it easier to click on the mouse and to make it work better if you want to try that. There you go.
Oh, there it went. Okay, thanks. So if you've been a member of council for a while, you've seen this slide used before for a variety of different programs. This slide is meant to really show the different types of programs and grant mechanisms that we have at NIEHS that support the training and career development and research careers of our workforce. So we have programs that will really support a high school student or an undergraduate student getting their first experience doing environmental health research through, for example, our 25 programs. They be supported through the pre and postdoctoral training through our T32 and fellowships, along with the career transitions, the K99R00, all the way through the different research mechanisms up to that R35 River Award that we heard about yesterday. A number of these programs have diversity components in them. These are the things we want to focus on today. For example, we have a diversity-focused F31 predoctoral fellowship that we'll be hearing about shortly. NIEHS is now participating in NIGMS's Mosaic K99R00 program. The Mosaic program stands for Maximizing Opportunities for Scientific and Academic Independent Careers. The Mosaic K99R00 program is a diversity-focused award where the successful applicants also then take part in sort of research or educational or career enhancement activities run by what are called UE5. These are Institutional Research Education Awards that will support the awardees as they transition to independence to help them be successful. So that's a new program that we've just started participating in. We offer a variety of diversity supplements that will support individuals from a wide variety of career stages and training stages. We have some R25 programs that are focused on underrepresented participants, and we also participate in some NIH wide programs like the SCORE program from NIGMS that are focused on research opportunities to enhance research going on at minority serving universities. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Annually, we train about 600 individuals through the different training mechanisms, training with a small t there. As you can see from the pie chart, about 52% of those individuals are predoctoral trainees, another 20% are postdocs. This represents the majority of our efforts through our T32 institutional training programs, also include some of the pre and postdoctoral fellowships that we offer and support. The 25% of the individuals that are undergraduates are primarily participating in our R25 programs. We also can account for the small number of high school students and teachers also that are participating through those R25 programs, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. It should be noted that about 23% of the participants are participating in programs focused on increasing diversity. So these are focused on participants that are underrepresented in the biomedical research workforce. And I would mention here that underrepresented through like our R25 programs is broadly defined as both racial and ethnic groups that are underrepresented, but also individuals with disabilities and individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the underrepresented category really is inclusive of those types of individuals as well. At this point, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Steve Toyoshime from our program analysis branch, and he's going to talk about the diversity F31 predoctoral fellowships. So Steve.
All right, thank you, Mike. So I'm going to begin this portion of the presentation by briefly going over the National Research Service Award for individual predoctoral fellowships to promote diversity in health-related research, which I'll be referring to as the F31 Diversity Fellowship Program. Sorry. So as many of you are aware, NIEHS funds several types of fellowships whose purpose is to support full-time research for pre or postdoctoral candidates. These fellowships are awarded to individuals and include funds for stipends, tuition and fees, as well as training. Of note, awards are restricted to US citizens or permanent residents and provide no direct support for research. As I mentioned, NIEHS participates in several NRSA fellowship opportunities, which are listed here. These run from supporting predoctoral candidates all the way to senior fellows. Today, I'll be focusing on the third program listed here, the F31 Diversity Fellowship Program. The stated purpose of this program is to enhance the diversity of the biomedical research workforce by supporting the research training of predoctoral students from diverse backgrounds, including those from groups that are underrepresented in the biomedical, behavioral, or clinical research workforce. Now, NIEHS has participated in the program since the early 90s, but I wanted to begin with some overall data from the program focusing on the past 20 years. As orientation, the fiscal year is listed on the x-axis, and the number of applications is on the y-axis. The number of awarded applications are shown in blue, while those that are not awarded are in green. Now, since 2001, we have funded 41 fellows out of 145 total applications, which comes out to an award rate of 28%. As you can see from the graph, the number of applications received vary from year to year, from 1 in 2003 to a high of 13 in 2013. One thing to point out is if we focus on the most recent 5-year period, we see increasing numbers of applications. However, the award rate is low, which represents a potential opportunity for intervention. Next, I wanted to briefly touch on program outcomes. Here I present an update of an analysis conducted by my DIRT colleague Brittany Trottier, which was presented at EHS Fest 4 years ago. Focusing on fiscal years 2005 through 2019, we funded 29 individuals who have branched out into various scientific careers. 9 of the awardees are either in graduate school or in a postdoctoral position. 4 awardees hold full-time positions in academia, including 1 fellowship recipient who is now an assistant professor. 4 hold positions at government agencies, including at the Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration. Finally, 12 now hold industry positions, including a toxicologist at Merck and a scientist at Novartis. These data show that even though the majority of F31 Diversity Fellowship recipients are not in academia, they are still active contributors to science in a variety of ways. So with that, I will conclude my brief overview of the F31 Diversity Fellowship Program, and I'll now pass it back off to Dr. Mike Humble to discuss institutional training programs.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so I'll talk now about our institutional training programs. These include our T32 pre and postdoctoral programs, as well as several R25 programs that we support. So our institutional T32 programs, I think most people are familiar with these. This is the primary means by which NIH and NIEHS supports pre and postdoctoral training. The idea here is to provide these individuals with support, much like the fellowships, while they're in the early phases or postdoctoral phases of their training to become environmental health scientists. Our T32 programs support about 400 trainees per year. You can see from the chart the ratio of pre-docs to postdocs. On any given year, we have approximately 120 new pre-doctoral trainees appointed to our programs and about 60 postdoctoral trainees. So it's about a 2-to-1 ratio between pre-docs and postdocs. You might wonder why the 180 new students is different from the 400 trainees. I'll just point out that many of the trainees are appointed for more than 1 year. They might be appointed for 2 or 3 years, and that adds up to our 400 total trainees. Whoops. Yep, okay. One of the requirements for our T32 programs is that they have to have a recruitment plan to enhance diversity. We had our program analysis branch look through our current programs and the progress reports and applications to see what types of things are the T32s doing to recruit and enhance diversity within their programs. They identified 21 different recruiting strategies across all the programs. Some of the more common strategies were they were attending recruiting fairs, just doing some general advertising at those. They were attending specific conferences that were focused on underrepresented populations. Some of the programs were tapping into undergraduate programs at their universities that might be focused on underrepresented participants. Other programs were tapping into or using R25 programs, again, as a source for students who can then enter into their T32 programs and enhance diversity. This slide shows the racial differences or breakdown of our trainees across our T32s for a variety of years. I think what the data shows is that we are, we have a lot of well-represented, used Dr. Valentine's language, a lot of well-represented trainees, but we're really not doing a very good job on the underrepresented categories. So I think despite the efforts to enhance recruitment, I think this shows that there's some room for improvement. So this is something we can probably discuss. One of the things we realized years ago is that if we want to encourage students or make younger students aware of the environmental health sciences as a career option, that we really need to reach out beyond, the pre-doctoral level where students have already sort of figured out what they want to do, and really find ways to let undergraduates or even high school students realize that environmental health science exists as a field. So about, I guess, 14 years ago, we created a program using the R25 mechanism called our STEER program. STEER stood for Short-Term Educational Experiences for Research in the Environmental Health Sciences. This is a program that would give undergraduates and high school students research experience in the environmental health sciences during the summer break from school. They get to work full-time on research projects under the mentorship of academic professors. The NIH, about the time when we were getting ready to put out the next iteration, the next funding opportunity for this program, the NIH created a nearly identical program that they called their Summer Research Experience Program. It also targeted high school students and undergraduates, but also expanded the program to include science teachers, which I thought was terrific. So since that point, since roughly 2011, we've been participating in the NIH program. This has been very nice because it allows for a much more flexible program. Instead of waiting every 5 years for applications to come in, there's a receipt date every year. So people get an idea, hey, it might be interesting to have an R25 program. They'll contact me, we can discuss things, and there's an opportunity to apply as we go. We currently have 13 of these R25 summer research programs. The programs, it's not a requirement for these programs that they be focused strictly on underrepresented participants. They do, like the T32 programs, need to have a recruitment plan to enhance diversity. So they do have to outline what they will be doing to enhance or to include diversity within their participant pools. However, 6 of the 13 programs focus solely on participants that are underrepresented in biomedical research. Again, that could include racial and ethnic diversity, individuals with disabilities, or individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. Currently, we support approximately 130 participants per year through these R25 summer programs. Most of those are undergraduates. We have one program that includes high school students and one program that's focused on high school teachers. About 5 years ago, we created another program, another R25 program, this time specifically focused on diversity. We call this our Undergraduate Research Education Program, or our UP program, to enhance diversity in environmental health sciences. This also uses an R25 program. It focuses on undergraduates, generally juniors and seniors. Like the summer programs, this program offers full-time support for these participants to do environmental health science research at these universities. But this program also then will continue to support these participants during the school year. So they'll work part-time as they're able to continue their research, continue interactions with their mentors, with the research groups in which they're involved, so that they can come back for the second summer and be, hit the ground, ready to go without really, having to reinvent the wheel and forgetting what they had done the previous summer. So we can support these participants for up to 2 years. The first iteration of this program, we had 6 awards. These started April 2015, had about 150 participants during those 5 years. Just this past summer, we expanded the program. We now have 9 awards. These awards went out again late spring or early summer. And our current UP program will support about 50 students per year. Some programs are 4 to 5 students in size, others maybe up to 8. One of the questions we always have with these programs, well, are they making a difference? Basically, where are the participants now? What are they doing? One of the challenges we have following undergraduates, it's hard to track them, but the advantage we had with the UP program is that since this program was re-announced, the existing programs that came in to renew had a progress report where they actually outlined what their participants are doing. So I tried to lump the activities into a variety of categories, kind of give an idea of how things are going. So based on the progress of the applications, about 18%, about 1/5 of the students at the time the reports were written were still enrolled in college. Kind of makes sense, it's a 5-year program, so about 1/5 of the students would still be enrolled in college. Of the students that have completed the program and graduated, about 24% are in the workforce in either environmental, occupational health, or in some sort of a STEM job. About 22% are enrolled in some sort of graduate program, might be an MPH program or other master's degree or graduate school in general. 17% of the students were enrolled in medical school, vet school, or dental school. And about 12% were what I would call undetermined. These were students who were maybe still trying to figure out what they were going to do. These may have been students who were kind of lost to tracking. That happens every once in a while. You might notice that the numbers here don't add up to 100%. There are a few students who start the program that don't finish, and that kind of makes up the difference. But anyway, I think the net result is that this shows that the students are staying in science. It's encouraging that a number of them are going on to graduate school, whether it's research-based or medical or veterinary school type programs. So it's a nice way to see that at least our participants are staying in science, and I think that's a great thing. This map shows the location of all these institutional training programs. The blue dots are our T32 training programs. The green dots are the R25 summer programs. The purpley colored ones are the R25 Diversity Up programs. So you can see we've got a nice distribution of programs. You'll see some of the circles actually are have two colors on them. These are programs and universities that have both a T32 and an R25 program, one or the other. And as I mentioned earlier, some of those T32 programs are using the R25 to really enhance the diversity recruitment of their T32 programs. Some of the R25 programs are actually partnering with minority serving institutions and HBCUs as a way to recruit students to their programs, to their R25 programs. I think that brings up the important role HBCUs, minority serving institutions, play in the pipeline of students going into the biomedical research field. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing with HBCUs and minority serving institutions. One of the things I mentioned earlier, just as an example of a program, is that we participate in the NIGMS Support for Competitive Research, or SCORE program. The SCORE program is a collection of unique mechanisms called the SC1, SC2, and SC3 grant mechanisms that are designed to help professors, researchers in minority serving institutions to really help develop the research competitiveness that they have so that ultimately they can successfully compete for R01s. The ideal candidate might start with, say, an SC2 pilot project award to develop some preliminary data. Maybe they then use that data for an SC1 research award, or maybe they go straight to an R01 award. So the idea is ultimately to help these instructors, these researchers, get started so that they can ultimately move away from SCORE support into the regular R01 research pool. The applications that come in that have an environmental health science are assigned to NAEHS. Those that score well ultimately are funded through NIGMS, even though they have that NAEHS assignment. That gives the researchers an opportunity to work with us as an institute. We get to know who they are, they get to know who we are, and we can then work to support their careers moving forward. So that's an example, at least, of an NIH program that we participate in. At this point, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Fred Tyson from the Genes Environmental Health Branch. He'll talk about another program we've had in the past called our ARCH program. So, Fred?
Thank you, Mike. I hope that I'm able to navigate the slides as well as you were. It says I can control it, so I'm going to try. So, good morning. The ARCH program, this is really a historical perspective because this program ended about 10 years ago. Okay, but the ARCH program was initially established to enhance research capacity at minority serving institutions through collaborations with established investigators at research intensive universities. And the idea here was to enhance research infrastructure and capacity, as well as developing a cadre of principal investigators or PIs at participating minority serving institutions who would be able to submit competitive RPG applications. Between 1999 and 2006, NIEHS issued 4 different RFAs, and we made 6 awards to the collaborating institutional pairs that are listed on the slide in that second bullet. Again, this is a program that's passed, so I'm just kind of giving you a quick summary, quick and dirty summary. The program did have an evaluation component, and key metrics of success are shown under the outcomes. With regard to enhancing research capacity or research infrastructure, we required that each of the awards would establish environmental health science facility cores. Were required to have administrative cores as well. And in terms of success metrics, collectively, all of the awards produced 167 peer-reviewed manuscripts, which is not too shabby. And with regard to being able to submit competitive RPG applications, you'll see that 4 of the institutions actually submitted a total of about 90 applications, with 16 of them being funded, which rounds out to kind of about an 18% success rate, which is really pretty good. But keep in mind, this is really an overall summary of the program. The ARCH program actually had a really mixed kind of success with the individual grants, where some of the grantees or grant programs achieved very successful outcomes, while others were probably something less than that. So the outcome measures you see on this slide were really not even close to being uniformly distributed across the awards. And we learned several lessons from supporting what at the time was called a pilot program. A key message or a key lesson learned that we can take home from our support of the ARCH program was that the level of institutional commitment from the university where the award was made, or the minority serving institution, was really instrumental in having a successful outcome for the program. And we think that certainly can be predictive of a successful or something that would be less than successful outcome. It's how engaged and how committed is the institution that's received the ARCH award in actually increasing and enhancing their research capacity. This could only be really one component, and certainly the institution needs to do several other things if that's what they wanted to do. And so we can assume that, or not we can assume, but we know that lessons that have been learned from the ARCH program certainly should be able to inform and provide guidance for any additional relevant activities that the NAEHS may choose to pursue. So this says I can advance or whatever, but okay. Okay, so sorry that I missed that last slide. Okay, this next section, I'm going to move on to talk about diversity supplements. And tell you this is actually an NIH-wide program. Many of you are probably familiar with the NIH Diversity and Supplement Program. And NIH uses this program to improve diversity in the workplaces that NIH grants support through research grants. I'm the POC for this program at NIEHS and participate in an NIH-wide network of POCs representing each participating IC. This program supports individuals from underrepresented segments of the population, which includes, but is not limited to, ethnic and racial minorities. In addition to ethnic and racial minorities, other eligible candidates for this support include individuals with disabilities or from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And I would ask that you refer to the PAR for specifics on eligibility. And I'll also note that the applicant institution requesting support really determines whether or not a candidate is eligible based on their own definitions of what constitutes underrepresented at their own institution. And obviously there may be some other eligibility things that may disqualify a candidate, but for the most part, it's the submitting institution that determines that eligibility. And I'll note also on this slide, we also list a PAR which targets candidates for re-entry into the research career after there's been an eligible interruption in their career or their training. And again, I would ask that you refer to the PAR itself for specifics on eligibility. So on this next slide, first of all, I want to thank Amanda Garten from the Genes Environment and Health Branch for capturing and presenting this data that will be on this slide and the next slide. Between 2011 and 2019, NIEH has received a total of 158 applications or supplement requests for diversity supplements during this time. 26 of them were rejected because of different things that impacted candidates' eligibility. But out of this total number that we received, we made 105 diversity and re-entry supplement awards. What I want to do is just really give you the take-home message from this slide and draw your attention to this panel at the bottom, this blue panel, which basically tells you that the success rate for these supplement requests has been over 80%. Okay, and that's obviously really great, but as we think about this later today, let's think are we doing enough with this program and how we might be able to improve even this success rate. Now this slide actually is asking us or telling us where these supplement awards have been made. And by where, we're talking about both geographically as well as where the candidates are in their career stage. Not surprisingly, geographically, the largest concentration of awards were made in states that have institutions with a substantive number of NAEHS RPG awards. Okay, in terms of career stage, most of the recipients of this support are at the pre-doc level, followed not so closely by postdocs. This actually correlates pretty well with the slide that Mike showed earlier regarding career stage distribution of NAEHS supported trainees. And for the afternoon discussion on this, we may want to consider if this is the most desirable distribution, or should we be actively pursuing shifting this distribution towards either the undergraduate or investigator ends of the spectrum. Okay, so this next slide tells us something about how, the efficacy of this program, and to determine that, we wanted to know where have these individuals gone after this training support, and do they stay in science? We've actually been able to do some of this evaluation of this program, which was led by Brittany Trottier when she was in GEHB, and originally presented this this information at the EHS Fest back in 2016. And what this slide presents is a summary of what that evaluation revealed. And I just want to leave you with an overview of the key findings that we learned. So despite some of the limitations on tracking demographics that we've heard about earlier today, we were able to actually locate individuals who have been supported by the diversity supplement. So we can track folks, okay? We find that these individuals are staying in the sciences, with most of them staying within environmental health, with a focus in environmental health sciences. We find that the post-baccalaureates are going on to graduate schools to train for terminal degrees. And overall, the program seems to be doing its job. However, we recognize there are always going to be ways to improve, and we certainly look forward to discussing some of your ideas on how we might improve this program and what it does later on in the discussion this afternoon. So at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to Sharon Beard, who's going to discuss the worker training program. And trying to move it, and it's not moving.
Thank you, Fred.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Beard, the industrial hygienist for the worker training program. Excuse me, the slides are not moving.
Hey, Sharon, you should be getting control soon.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You just have to click on the screen twice to get your mouse working.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. The Cooperative Agreement Program continues to train workers in hazardous environments, mostly dealing with hazardous materials, waste, nuclear materials, emergency, and chemical response. We have conducted training in every state and U.S. province, reaching 3.5 million workers since 1987. NAEHS staff and grantees have responded to numerous natural and man-made disasters, as you can see listed here, and of course recently by developing training for COVID-19, Hurricane Laura, and disaster response around the West Coast wildfires. We are excited that this year we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Environmental Career Worker Training Program, where we have trained over 13,000 individuals and have successfully provided employment in construction and environmental fields at an overall job placement rate of 70%. For the worker training program diversity inclusion effort, the environmental career leads with over 80% of the trainees representing diverse ethnicities and backgrounds. The goal of that program is to recruit, train, and place individuals that are un- or underemployed in jobs to increase the number of underrepresented and underserved community members in these careers. In completing our recompetition this year of our entire program, We broadened our language to address the NAEHS strategic plan to expand greater workforce diversity by encouraging programs to increase diversity of key staff and trainers, and use approaches such as multilingual training to address environmental and occupational health disparities, as well as environmental justice by promoting partnerships and outreach to historically Black colleges and universities, minority-serving institutions, and organizations such as tribal communities and community-based organizations. For example, our building capacity report indicated that we reach over 101 Native American and Native Alaskan communities, and we train thousands of workers via direct training and train-to-trainer methods in over 60 different courses. Also, under our disaster response work, we work with vulnerable, low-income, and immigrant populations who are most at risk of environmental and occupational exposure to hazards around hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and now COVID-19. With an emphasis on training of high-risk essential workers. We continue to do outreach to translate knowledge via webinars, workshops, presentations, and via interagency working groups to actively engage and share resources on our training and how we can support communities. The August 2020 NAEHS Factor here features an article on our Environmental Career Worker Training Program, the 25th anniversary, that provides a great summary of our training efforts with emphasis on how the program has changed lives for those who have been trained under the program, as well as build capacity for those numerous community-based organizations that we partner with to conduct the training, and they provide substantial life skills, supportive services, as well as technical training. One area of note is our economic impact for the Environmental Career Program. This 2015 report was conducted with data collected from 1995 to 2013 by grantees, as each program is required to track students for at least 1 year after completion. And because of the structure in place for those who need refresher training, many programs track students longer. The team of economists indicated these key results. That with the government investment of $3 million annually, the return on investment is estimated as $1.7 billion, or roughly $100 million annually. Graduates are 59% more likely to obtain employment as a result of this program and to obtain higher earnings. And also the overall reduction of government expenditures is roughly $40 million annually. For example, the program reduces crime-related costs as successful graduates continue to work, therefore decreases recidivism or returning to prison. This shows the economic impact of one of our highly successful grantees for the New York, New Jersey consortium led by Rutgers University and the New York City Carpenters, where they have a robust economic impact tracking system. Trainees have come into the program with an average income of around $15,000. And in less than 25 years, they earn around $97,000. An example is Mr. Coleman, a 2014 graduate who was making minimum wage when he came into the program, had unstable housing, and was previously incarcerated. He continued his apprenticeship, and in 2018 as a journeyman carpenter in New York City, and is now working and making over $100,000 annually. Has purchased a home, paid for his child's education, and is investing in retirement. He continues to work as a role model and mentor to current students. This is what this program can truly transform lives. For more information about our Environmental Career Program and its impacts and accomplishments, I encourage you to go see the 25th anniversary page listed here. Thank you. Now, Dr. Pat Maskin will share more about moving forward.
Thanks, Sharon. Excellent talk. Great program. I will see if I can get control back here. Great. So you've seen and been given a brief overview of the kinds of programs we have or we have had. In the discussion later, we're going to ask you for your input on these ideas on how to enhance recruitment and retention of students from underrepresented groups by using these programs, expanding them in some way, or developing new ones. But in DRT, we've been giving this topic a lot of thought, as you may expect, and I've come up with a few ideas that I'd kind of like to put on the table for consideration and for your input later on. First and most obvious is to do more proactive outreach efforts to organizations like minority serving institutions, but other organizations that are interested in promoting diversity as well as outreaching to our own grantees to try to increase the number of diversity supplement applicants, as Fred alluded to during his talk. Another obvious action is to join existing NIH programs such as the Mosaic program, but there are others as well. We also plan to work with the other ICs to strengthen the diversity requirements for the NRSA training programs that Mike was talking about, to give a little more teeth to these requirements maybe. We're also considering some new programs, such as an idea that I think David Balshall actually came up with, which was to do a diversity area grant program. Area grants are given to colleges or universities that don't have a lot of NIH funding, and it provides training for research, but also for training of undergraduates. So could we target some of these area grants to minorities, undergrads or minority serving institutions? And the last idea, which I thought was fairly clever, and I'm giving Cindy Lawler credit for this one, involves kind of doing what we did with the ONCE program that you heard about yesterday when Carol was giving a presentation. And the idea is that we would, but applying these techniques to diversity supplement awardees or F31 awardees or any other trainings. First, we could provide more one-on-one mentoring on things like grant writing and navigating the NIH process, especially around points of transition in their careers, like going from a postdoc to a junior faculty, K99R00, for instance. And secondly, we'd like to consider developing a network of these trainees to facilitate interactions among them. As Carol described for the ONCE program, getting ONCE grant awardees together has been very successful for making professional career contacts, but it also allows the newer awardees to learn from the more experienced ones, their experiences they've had moving through their career. Still working on the details, but we'd be interested in your thoughts on this, plus or minus. And so the last topic I just want to touch on briefly, because I don't need to say much. Dr. Valentine, I think, covered this fairly well, but we do want to talk about it. And that is the issue of funding disparity, something, of course, that is near and dear to our hearts. This is the top part of a graph I showed earlier, showing how we're losing the number of, the percentile goes down from college students to doctoral students. If you look at NIH applications, that number continues to go down. Only 2% of all NIH applications are from Black or African American PIs. And if you look at NIHS, we're even worse. And then when you look at the awardees, it's only down around 1%. So clearly we have a long way to go. This graph, again, just shows what Dr. Valentine showed, and I won't spend too much time on it, but what it shows is that of all the NIH in blue or the NIEHS grants in green, only about 1.5% are from Black or African PIs. And in terms of awards, that goes down even further below to around 1%. The take-home message from this is that over the years, this green line is not getting any better, either for NIH applications or NIEHS applications. And similarly for awards, the numbers are not getting better. So we do have a lot of room to grow. And finally, this shows the success rate for biracial group, showing that white PIs have a success rate of about 12.5 for NIH, about 10.5 for NIEHS, but African American or Black PIs have only about 0.2% or 0.02. So a lot of room to grow. So that kind of ends this part of the presentation. I want to thank all the presenters who have talked about this. Again, our goal here was to provide you information about the programs we have, and moving forward, how can we use these programs to enhance diversity and improve funding disparity gaps. I want to finish up my part of this right now by thanking all the speakers here, Sharon, Mike, Steve, and Fred. But I also have to thank those that provided us with the data to present here, Takara, Christy, the other Christy, Amanda, and I also want to thank Claudia for all of her input, as well as all the DIRT leadership for inputting into this. And I want to thank Anne Deschamps from Ripple Effect Communications for her efforts to make this such a lovely presentation. With that, what I would like to do now, we're right on schedule as a matter of fact. I would like to take a break now. When we come back, we'll start a discussion part. If you have questions at that point about any of what you've heard today, we can address those then. Otherwise, we would like to address the questions that I presented to you at the beginning of the talk. And with, oh, sorry, I have a raised hand. Let me see what that is. Yeah, Karen, did you have a question real quick?
I did have a very quick question or something for thought, because I have to, I'm hearing a session at the EMGS meeting and I won't be in the afternoon session, or
okay.
not much of it. I just wanted to bring up, all of these are extremely important topics, but one thing that we don't always talk about is the after effect or the negative effects of bias and trying to overcome bias, in that being a female or a minority group of any kind, we often are questioned if we obtain a position of leadership or if we have success. Then others often have an implicit, sometimes explicit bias, saying, well, of course you got that because you're a female, or of course, and I think that's something that I don't know how to address, but it's something that we all need to think about, because once we achieve things based on our qualifications, but it sometimes does not come across that way. And I think that's almost as harmful as not having, things put in place to assist to overcome the biases.
A great point. Thank you for including that.
Yeah, Karen, that's a really good point. This came up repeatedly in the listening sessions that we had with staff here. So the underrepresented minorities and women, it's just really unfair.
Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
I appreciate that. All right, I again thank the presenters and people who helped us with the presentation. Let's take a 15-minute break and get back here. It looks like 12:47, and we'll start our afternoon discussion, which is the highlight of the meeting, I hope. All right, see you in a minute.